December 7th, 1941, a date seared into American memory, marked not just the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the beginning of a narrative that would elevate one battleship above all others in the public imagination. While smoke still rose from the shattered Pacific Fleet, a single vessel escaped the devastation, steaming safely beyond the carnage. The USS Iowa, commissioned nearly 2 years later, would become the flagship of an entire class. Yet her sister ship, the USS Missouri, would claim a throne in American hearts that historians argue she never truly earned through combat performance. The Missouri slid down the ways at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on January 29, 1944, christened by Margaret Truman, daughter of the then-senator from Missouri, Harry S. Truman. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Here was a floating city of steel, stretching 887 feet from bow to stern, displacing 58,000 tons when fully loaded. Armed with 9 16-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small automobile over 23 miles. The press called her Mighty Mo, and the American public, starved for good news and symbols of invincibility, embraced the nickname with fervor that bordered on religious devotion. But beneath the propaganda and patriotic fervor lay a more complicated truth. The Missouri represented the apex of battleship design at precisely the moment when battleships had become obsolete. Aircraft carriers, not these floating fortresses, would decide the Pacific War. Yet the Navy brass, many of whom had spent entire careers in battleship service, could not quite accept this reality. They poured resources into these behemoths, even as carrier task forces proved their worth at Coral Sea and Midway. According to detailed analyses published in the Naval War College Review during the 1980s, the Missouri's actual combat record pales compared to her reputation. When she finally joined the war in January 1945, Japan's navy had already been effectively destroyed. The Imperial Japanese fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, existed only in fragments. The Missouri would fire her main batteries in anger exactly 3 times during World War II, all inshore bombardment operations supporting amphibious landings. Her first action came at Iwo Jima in February 1945, where she joined other battleships in pounding Japanese positions before the Marine landings. Impressive certainly, but hardly unique holder. Less celebrated battleships performed identical missions with equal effectiveness. In March, she supported the Okinawa invasion, again providing shore bombardment. Her 16-inch shells obliterated pillboxes and bunkers, but so did the shells from the battleships Tennessee, California, and West Virginia, all Pearl Harbor survivors that had been raised, rebuilt, and returned to service with far less fanfare. The Missouri's third and final combat action occurred in July 1945, when she joined in bombarding the Japanese home islands themselves. By then, Japan's defeat was inevitable. American submarines had strangled her commerce. American bombers had incinerated her cities, and American carriers had swept her skies clean of aircraft. The battleship bombardments, while psychologically significant, changed nothing strategically. Yet somehow, the Missouri transcended her modest combat record to become America's battleship. September 2nd, 1945, dawned gray and humid over Tokyo Bay. Aboard the USS Missouri, anchored among dozens of Allied warships, history prepared to unfold. General Douglas MacArthur had specifically requested the Missouri as the site for Japan's formal surrender. Not because of her combat achievements, but because of political connections. President Harry Truman had recently assumed office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, and having the surrender signed aboard his home state's namesake ship carried undeniable political weight. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had no substantive objection. One battleship was as good as another for a ceremony. At precisely 08:02 that morning, Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu limped aboard on his wooden leg. Followed by General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Imperial Japanese Army, the document they would sign had been prepared weeks in advance. The ceremony itself would last less than 30 minutes. Yet in those 30 minutes, the Missouri secured a place in American mythology that no amount of actual combat could have provided. Photographers captured every moment. Newsreel cameras rolled continuously. Radio correspondents described the scene to millions listening worldwide. MacArthur spoke in his characteristic dramatic style, his words crafted for posterity rather than the moment. "We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. He spoke of hope, of rebuilding, of moving beyond the hatred and destruction. Then, with a series of fountain pens provided for the occasion, he signed. Nimitz signed. Representatives from China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand each added their signatures. Finally, reluctantly, the Japanese delegates signed their nation's unconditional surrender. Information drawn from the official Navy Historical Center records indicates that nothing about the Missouri's design or capability made her uniquely suited for this role. The Iowa, New Jersey, or Wisconsin, her sister ships would have served equally well. The Battleship South Dakota, which had seen far more combat and actually engaged Japanese surface forces in night actions, might have been more appropriate symbolically. But South Dakota was not named for the president's home state. The ceremony transformed the Missouri from warship into shrine. Tourists would eventually walk her decks by the millions, standing on the very planks where Japan surrendered. School children would learn her name before they learned the names of the carrier's Enterprise, Yorktown or Lexington ships that had actually turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Missouri became, in the American imagination, the ship that won World War II, despite having contributed less to victory than dozens of other vessels. Naval historians have long noted the irony. The Missouri represented the old way of naval warfare, ships built to slug it out gun-to-gun with enemy battleships. In climactic surface actions that never came, by the time she entered service, such battles belonged to a bygone era. Carrier aircraft, submarines, and amphibious assault had revolutionized naval combat. Battleship, for all its impressive majesty, had become a supporting player. Yet the Missouri's role in the surrender ceremony overshadowed these realities. Americans wanted to believe their mightiest battleship had brought Japan to its knees. Even though American submarines had actually severed Japan's supply lines, American carriers had destroyed her naval aviation, and American bombers, culminating with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, had forced the surrender. March 1946 brought the Missouri back to American waters, where she received a hero's welcome in New York Harbor that rivaled anything in the city's long history of ticker-tape parades. Tugboats sprayed water in celebratory arcs. Crowds lined the shores. The battleship had become more than steel and guns. She had become a floating monument to American victory. But among naval professionals, particularly those who had served on carriers or submarines, a different conversation was taking place in wardrooms and officers' clubs across the fleet. Commander Eugene Fluckey, who had skippered the submarine USS Barb to legendary success against Japanese shipping, reportedly remarked to fellow submariners that his single boat had sunk more enemy tonnage than all the Iowa-class battleships combined. He was not wrong. The Barb sent 17 Japanese vessels to the bottom, totaling over 96,000 tons. The Missouri's direct contribution to sinking enemy ships, 0. She never engaged enemy surface vessels. She never shot down enemy aircraft. Her 16-inch guns, capable of penetrating the thickest armor ever mounted on a warship, never tested themselves against an enemy battleship. Research documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume history of United States naval operations in World War I provides detailed accounts of every significant naval engagement. The Missouri appears in these volumes primarily in administrative context as a flagship, as the surrender site, as a unit in the fleet, but not as a decisive combat element. Compare this to the carrier Enterprise, which participated in nearly every major carrier battle of the Pacific War, from Midway to the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf. The Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American ship in World War II. The Missouri earned 3. The battleship's supporters, both then and now, argue that evaluating her purely on enemy ships sunk misses the point. Battleships in the latter stages of the Pacific War served primarily for shore bombardment and anti-aircraft defense of carrier task forces. Got by these metrics, they insist the Missouri performed admirably. Her 5-inch dual-purpose guns put up impressive anti-aircraft barrages. Her main batteries pulverized Japanese fortifications. She provided a stable platform for fleet flagships with her spacious quarters and extensive communications equipment. Yet even accepting these arguments, the Missouri's performance was merely adequate, not exceptional. The older Pennsylvania, despite being badly damaged at Pearl Harbor, supported more amphibious operations and fired more rounds in anger than the Missouri. The Mississippi and Idaho, both ancient pre-war battleships, served throughout the Pacific Campaign with distinction but without fanfare. These ships, and others like them, formed the unglamorous workhorses of the fleet, doing the same job as the Missouri, but lacking her political connections and symbolic resonance. The question that naval historians continue to debate centers on resources. Each Iowa-class battleship cost approximately $100 million to build in 1940s currency, equivalent to over $1.5 billion today. That some could have built multiple Essex-class carriers or dozens of submarines, vessels that demonstrably contributed more to victory. June 25, 1950, shattered the Missouri's peacetime routine. North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, crashed across the 38th parallel, driving the ill-prepared South Korean army before them. The United States, committed to containing communist expansion, rushed forces to the Korean peninsula. The Navy, its wartime fleet now, largely mothballed or scrapped, called back veterans from reserve status and reactivated ships stored in backwater anchorages. Among them, inevitably, was the Missouri. She arrived off the Korean coast in September 1950. Just as General MacArthur's audacious Incheon landing turned the war's tide. The Missouri's role in this crucial operation proved minimal. The invasion succeeded before she could provide fire support. Instead, she joined the naval blockade, steaming up and down Korea's coastline. Her 16-inch guns thundering against North Korean positions, supply depots, and transportation networks. For the next 3 years, with brief intervals for maintenance and resupply, the Missouri and other recalled battleships performed the unglamorous but essential work of interdiction and shore bombardment. Korea represented the last war in which battleships played a significant role. And even here, their contribution has been overstated, according to analyses published in the journal Joint Force Quarterly during the early 2000s. Naval aviation delivered the decisive blows in Korea. Carrier-based aircraft flew thousands of sorties, destroyed bridges and factories, provided close air support to ground forces, and maintained air superiority over North Korean skies. The battleships, impressive as they were, provided what amounted to mobile artillery. The Missouri fired her main batteries extensively during the Korean War. Far more than in World War II, her gunners developed impressive accuracy, sometimes placing shells within 50 yards of friendly positions, danger close by any standard. Marine and Army units calling for fire support learned to trust the battleships' ability to deliver devastating salvos precisely where needed. Yet this effectiveness only highlighted the fundamental question: was maintaining a 58,000-ton battleship with a crew of over 2,000 sailors the most efficient way to deliver fire support? One Missouri could fire 9 16-inch shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, every 90 seconds. Impressive, certainly. But a single aircraft carrier could launch dozens of planes, each capable of delivering similar or greater explosive power, with far more flexibility and precision. The battleship could not reach targets inland, beyond her gun's 23-mile range. Aircraft could strike anywhere in North Korea. The battleship required extensive logistical support, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all in massive quantities. Carrier operations, while also logistically demanding, provided far greater return on investment. Stories from the Korean War emphasized the Missouri's psychological impact. North Korean and Chinese soldiers learned to dread the distinctive sound of 16-inch shells in flight, a sound like an oncoming freight train. Entire positions would surrender after a Missouri bombardment, their occupants emerging shaken and demoralized. American ground forces took comfort knowing the battleship stood offshore, ready to pulverize any enemy concentration. This psychological dimension was real and valuable, but psychological impact alone cannot justify the enormous resources required to maintain and operate a battleship. The Missouri earned 2 more battle stars in Korea, bringing her total to 5. January 1955 marked the Missouri's decommissioning. She steamed to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington, where workers stripped her of ammunition, pumped her fuel tanks dry, and began the process of preservation. Plastic sheeting covered her guns. Dehumidifiers ran continuously in her compartments, fighting the constant battle against rust. She joined a growing fleet of reserve ships, the Mothball Fleet, vessels maintained at minimal expense against the possibility of future need. Most would never return to service. The Missouri, however, remained special, remained symbolic, and that symbolism would eventually call her back. For nearly 30 years, she rested in quiet obscurity. Occasional tours brought curious visitors aboard, but the crowds were nothing like the immediate post-war years. New generations came of age without personal memory of World War II. The Cold War dominated American strategic thinking. And in that conflict, battleships seemed irrelevant. Nuclear submarines carrying ballistic missiles, carrier battle groups projecting power globally, and eventually satellite surveillance and precision-guided weapons defined modern naval warfare. The battleship belonged to museums and memories. Then came the 1980s, and President Ronald Reagan's vision of a 600-ship Navy. Reagan, master of symbolic politics, understood the battleship's emotional appeal to the American public. His Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, championed the reactivation of all 4 Iowa-class battleships. The Navy leadership, many of whom had served during the battleship era, supported the idea despite questions from younger officers who had never known a Navy that prized surface combat over aviation and submarines. The Missouri emerged from Bremerton in 1984, not merely reactivated but extensively modernized. Workers had stripped away some of her old 5-inch gun mounts, replacing them with modern missile launchers. Tomahawk cruise missiles gave her strike capability hundreds of miles inland. Harpoon anti-ship missiles provided modern surface warfare capability. Phalanx close-in weapons systems offered automated defense against incoming missiles. Sophisticated electronics replaced vacuum tube technology from the 1940s. The modernization cost over $500 million, enough to build 2 modern destroyers. Critics within the Navy questioned the wisdom of this investment. Data referenced in the proceedings of the United States Naval Institute during the mid-1980s reveals significant internal debate. Junior officers pointed out that the Missouri's armor, designed to defeat 16-inch shells, offered no protection against modern anti-ship missiles that struck from above or skimmed just above the waves. Her massive guns, impressive as they were, could not compete with air-launched precision-guided munitions for accuracy or flexibility. Her crew of over 1,500 sailors represented a significant manpower commitment when the Navy faced persistent recruiting challenges. Supporters countered that the Missouri provided capabilities no other platform could match. Her armor, they argued, gave her survivability in contested waters where thin-skinned destroyers and cruisers would be vulnerable. Her 16-inch guns delivered firepower without requiring aircraft or weather windows. Her presence intimidated adversaries and reassured allies. Most importantly, perhaps, she embodied American naval power in a way that abstract discussions of carrier air wings and submarine deployments never could. The debate revealed a fundamental split in naval thinking between traditionalists and modernizers. It's a split that had existed since carriers first challenged battleships for primacy in the 1920s. January 17, 1991, brought the Missouri back to war for the 3rd time in her career. Operation Desert Storm, the American-led coalition's campaign to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait, began with a massive air assault. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from American warships, including the Missouri, struck targets across Iraq. The media coverage was extensive, with reporters particularly drawn to the dramatic imagery of missiles launching from the battleship's modernized decks. The Missouri, once again, captured the public imagination, her distinctive profile silhouetted against tracer fire and explosions. Yet analysis of Desert Storm's naval component reveals the Missouri's contribution was largely symbolic rather than decisive. The battleship fired 28 Tomahawk missiles during the campaign. American submarines, cruisers, and destroyers fired hundreds more. Missouri's 16-inch guns, so impressive in their raw destructive power, fired 783 rounds in shore bombardment missions. Effective certainly, but representing a tiny fraction of the ordnance delivered against Iraqi forces. Coalition aircraft flew over 100,000 sorties, dropping 88,000 tons of bombs. The battleship's contribution, measured objectively, barely registered. Information detailed in the official Department of Defense report on Desert Storm operations makes clear that the war was won primarily through air power and the decisive ground campaign that followed. Iraqi forces, subjected to weeks of devastating air attacks, surrendered in droves when coalition ground forces began their advance. The naval gunfire support, including the Missouri's, supported the overall effort but did not determine outcomes. The Missouri did participate in one operation that generated significant media coverage. Deception Plan, where the battleships Wisconsin and Missouri conducted extensive shore bombardments and amphibious landing rehearsals, convincing Iraqi commanders that coalition forces would assault Kuwait from the sea. Iraqi forces redeployed to defend the coast, weakening their positions inland where the actual ground offensive would come. This deception succeeded brilliantly, but it raises an interesting question. Did it require battleships specifically, or would any visible naval presence have accomplished the same goal? Naval aviation advocates pointed out that carrier-based aircraft could have conducted the same deception missions while retaining far more flexibility. The battleships, tied to coastal waters by their guns' limited range, could not pursue Iraqi forces as they retreated. Carrier aircraft ranged across Iraq and Kuwait, attacking Iraqi units wherever they fled. Attack helicopters and ground-based tactical aviation provided close air support to advancing coalition units. The battleship's role, impressive in isolation, appears less significant when viewed in context. The Missouri's supporters note that her presence required far fewer sorties to deliver comparable firepower to specific targets. One battleship bombardment mission could deliver destruction equivalent to dozens of airstrikes. Freeing aircraft for other missions, this argument has merit but ignores the broader strategic picture. The coalition enjoyed absolute air superiority. Aircraft were not in short supply. The constraint was not availability of platforms, but identification of targets worth striking. Perhaps most tellingly, Desert Storm represented the Missouri's last combat deployment. The Navy decommissioned her again in March 1992, barely a year after the war's end. June 11, 1998, saw the Missouri arrive at her final berth, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, moored less than 500 yards from the USS Arizona Memorial. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The ship, where World War II effectively began for America, and the ship where it officially ended, united at last. The Missouri opened as a museum ship in January 1999, and the public response exceeded all expectations. Over 1 million visitors would walk her decks in the first year alone. The Missouri's transformation into a museum ship cemented her status as America's battleship. Tour guides led visitors through her spaces, telling stories of the surrender ceremony, of Korea, of Desert Storm. Hollywood reinforced the mythology. The 2012 film Battleship, while absurd in plot, featured the Missouri prominently, depicting elderly veterans reactivating her one more time to save Earth from alien invasion. The film was nonsense, but it tapped into a deep American affection for these massive ships and the era they represented. Yet the museum experience often glosses over inconvenient realities. The surrender ceremony receives extensive attention with detailed recreations and displays. The battleship's limited combat role, her questionable cost-effectiveness, the debates about her reactivation, these topics receive far less coverage. Visitors leave believing they have visited the ship that won the Pacific War, when in reality they have visited a ship that witnessed the war's end after contributing relatively little to achieving victory. Historical perspective drawn from contemporary naval scholarship reveals a pattern that extends beyond the Missouri to American military memory generally. Americans remember individual platforms, famous ships, celebrated tanks, legendary aircraft far more readily than they remember the systems, strategies, and unglamorous logistics that actually win wars. The Missouri makes for better stories than accounts of submarine warfare's systematic destruction of Japanese commerce, or carrier task forces, methodical elimination of Japanese naval aviation, or the amphibious capabilities that allowed American forces to hop across the Pacific. The contrast with the USS Enterprise is particularly stark. Enterprise participated in more major actions than any other carrier in the Pacific, absorbed horrific damage and survived, and directly contributed to American victory in virtually every way a ship could. She earned 20 battle stars, the most of any American ship in World War II, yet Enterprise was scrapped in 1958, broken up for metal despite efforts to preserve her. She exists now only in photographs and memories. The Missouri, with her 3 World War II battle stars and minimal combat contribution, rests in honored preservation, visited by millions. This disparity reflects not the ship's relative contributions, but the power of symbolic moments over sustained achievement. The Enterprise never hosted a surrender ceremony. She never became associated with a president. Her story, for all its genuine heroism and significance, lacked the narrative simplicity that captures public imagination. The Missouri story could be told in a single iconic photograph: Japanese officials signing surrender documents on her deck, MacArthur presiding, the war ending. 21st century naval historians, freed by time's passage from the emotional attachments of those who served, have begun more critical assessments of the Missouri's place in naval history. These reassessments do not diminish respect for the sailors who served aboard her or deny her importance as a historical artifact. Rather, they attempt to separate legend from reality, to understand what the Missouri actually accomplished versus what popular memory credits her with accomplishing. The consensus emerging from recent scholarship suggests the Missouri represents American naval power at its most contradictory moment. She was technologically superb, but strategically obsolete, beautifully designed for a type of warfare that no longer existed by the time she entered service. Her impressive specifications armor that could resist the largest naval guns ever made. Her own guns capable of destroying any ship afloat. Her sheer size and presence answered questions that World War II had already resolved. Carriers, not battleships, would dominate naval warfare. The Missouri and her sisters were magnificent anachronisms. Yet anachronisms can still matter. The Missouri's symbolic power, derided by those who prioritize measurable combat effectiveness, represents a genuine form of national power. Ships exist not merely to sink other ships or bombard shore targets, but to embody national strength and will. The Missouri, whatever her tactical limitations, excelled at this psychological dimension. Her presence reassured allies, impressed neutrals, and concerned adversaries. These effects, while difficult to quantify, should not be dismissed entirely. The deeper question concerns resources and opportunity costs. The money spent building, maintaining, reactivating, and modernizing the Missouri could have purchased other capabilities: more submarines, additional aircraft, improved logistics, enhanced training. Would these alternative investments have served American security interests better? Almost certainly yes, from a purely objective military perspective. But national defense exists within political and cultural contexts that pure military logic cannot fully address. The Missouri also represents broader patterns in how Americans remember wars. It's the tendency to focus on dramatic moments rather than sustained effort, to celebrate individual platforms rather than integrated systems, to prefer clear narratives over complex realities. These patterns shape not just how Americans remember the Missouri, but how they understand military affairs generally. This understanding, or misunderstanding, influences contemporary debates about defense spending, force structure, and strategic priorities. Modern naval officers studying the Missouri's history often draw lessons about the gap between capability and effectiveness, between technical specifications and strategic value. A platform can be superbly engineered and beautifully designed while still being poorly suited to its era's actual requirements. The Missouri was never a bad battleship. She was arguably the finest battleship ever built. But being the finest example of an obsolete type represents a hollow achievement. As the Missouri rests at Pearl Harbor, slowly succumbing despite preservation efforts to the inevitable decay that claims all physical things, her legacy remains contested. To most Americans, she is the battleship, the ship where World War II ended, a proud symbol of American military might. To naval historians and military professionals, she is something more complicated, a magnificent ship that arrived too late, achieved too little in combat, cost too much, and yet somehow captured the national imagination in ways that truly decisive vessels never managed. Both perspectives contain truth, and perhaps the real lesson lies in understanding how the same ship can be simultaneously both overrated and genuinely significant, how legend and reality intertwine in ways that defy simple categorization.